Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack how a 2,500-year-old text on deep forest meditation actually offers a completely timeless blueprint for finding inner peace, especially in our modern, high-anxiety technological era. We're looking specifically at a text called the Bhayabherava Sutta. Now, you might be wondering, what can an ancient discourse about monks sitting out in terrifyingly dark forests possibly teach us about navigating our chaotic, algorithm-driven world? Well, the answer is absolutely everything. As you'll see, mastering the darkest parts of the literal forest perfectly maps onto mastering the darkest, most anxious parts of our own minds.
The text actually kicks off with a really interesting encounter between the Buddha and a man named Jāṇussoṇi Brahmin, and he sets the stakes right away. He says, "Isolated forests are hard to endure. The forest seems snatching away the mind of a monk who has not attained concentration." Just think about that phrase for a second, snatching away the mind. It is highly relatable today, right? When we're left completely alone with our thoughts without our phones or any external distractions, our minds tend to just spiral into dread. Jāṇussoṇi believed that surviving in total isolation was basically impossible for anyone who hadn't already mastered their own focus.
All right, so here is our roadmap for today's journey. We'll start by defining the roots of fear. Look at how to purify the mind. Watch how the Buddha confronted terror directly. Ascend through the four jhanas. Explore the three knowledges. And finally, look at what all of this means for our future.
Okay, starting with Section 1, the roots of fear, the anatomy of anxiety.
So to really solve the problem of fear, we first have to understand why the dark forest, or honestly, our incredibly stressful modern world, causes us so much distress in the first place. The Buddha gives a fascinating response here. His core thesis is that fear isn't actually caused by the creepy forest itself, but rather by the internal impurities and defilements that we carry inside us. Think about an ordinary ascetic, someone just trying to meditate. They often go into the forest carrying a bunch of internal baggage, impure actions, bad intentions, greed. And by doing that, their own impurities literally invite fear and dread in. On the flip side, we have the noble one, which is how the Buddha refers to his own state. The noble one enters with entirely pure actions and intentions. Because the inside is completely clean, the outside environment, no matter how terrifying it is, just cannot shake them. They remain entirely fearless.
And this is where we see the sheer thoroughness of the Buddha's self-analysis. He essentially identified 16 specific defilements that trigger fear, and we can group these into three neat little buckets. First, our actions, like living dishonestly. Second, our thoughts and emotions, things like greed, malice, or outright panic. And third, our energy and focus, so sheer laziness or lack of concentration. The Buddha realized he was entirely free of all this internal baggage, which is exactly what gave him even greater confidence to dwell in the forest and face the dark. Moving on to Section 2, Purifying the Mind, moving from theory to practice. See, just identifying those defilements? That's only step one. To truly test his mind, the Buddha didn't just tiptoe around the issue, he actively triggered his own fear. He purposefully sought out the most desolate, terrifying tree, forest, and park shrines imaginable. And he didn't just go for a stroll on a sunny afternoon either. He deliberately chose the most intense, eerie nights of the lunar cycle, the 8th, 14th, and 15th nights of the half-month. These were the pitch-black nights of the dark moon, or nights with the stark, haunting illumination of a full moon. He basically walks straight onto a 500 BC horror movie set, intentionally thinking to himself, "Let me see that fear and dread?"
I mean, just imagine the sensory overload out there. In that pitch darkness, ordinary, everyday sounds, a deer approaching, a peacock dropping a branch, or even just the wind rustling the leaves, instantly become terrifying monsters to an unpurified mind. His environment was constantly trying to trick his brain into a state of total panic. He was constantly testing himself to see if the thought would arise, "Is this that fear and dread coming?" Which brings us to Section 3, Confronting Terror Directly, the four postures.
Knowing that fear was going to strike, the really crucial point here is how exactly the Buddha handled those massive spikes of adrenaline in the dark. And his method was just pure, uncompromising resolve based on the four fundamental postures: walking, standing, sitting, and lying down. The text tells us that if fear arose while he was walking back and forth, he absolutely refused to stand still, sit, or lie down. He would just keep walking until he had completely conquered that specific dread. If the fear came while he was standing, he wouldn't pace, he wouldn't sit. He stood his ground until the fear completely vanished. The exact same rule applied to sitting or lying down. He absolutely refused to change his posture as a way to escape the discomfort.
It's really worth taking a second to ask ourselves how we react to things today. When a sudden wave of anxiety hits us, maybe it's an unexpected "can we chat" Slack message from your boss, or a super stressful news notification on your phone, our instinct is almost always to escape. We frantically try to change our situation. We pick up our phones to scroll, we pace around the room, we look for a distraction. But the Buddha's approach was the exact opposite. Freeze, face the fear exactly as it found you, and do not move a muscle until you have mastered it.
Section 4. The 4 Jhanas, the meditative ascent.
Okay, so once that internal fear was completely wiped out and his mind was no longer getting pulled away by every rustling leaf, he was primed to ascend. He moved systematically through what are known as the 4 jhanas. Think of this like taking an elevator straight up through different levels of consciousness. He started at the first jhana, which is an initial joy and pleasure born purely from seclusion. Then he moved into the second jhana, characterized by profound internal confidence and a deeply focused, one-pointed mind. As that intense joy started to fade, he entered the third jhana, dwelling in pure, mindful awareness. And finally, he reached the fourth jhana. At this point, he moved entirely beyond former happiness and sadness, stepping into a state of absolute, unbreakable equanimity that is entirely beyond all pleasure and pain.
Section 5. 3 Knowledges of Night, the ultimate breakthrough.
Now, with a mind perfectly malleable and concentrated, the stage was fully set for the ultimate breakthrough. Over the 3 watches of the night, he mapped out a profound realization. In the first watch of the night, he directed his hyper-focused mind to recall his past lives, literally hundreds of thousands of previous existences. Then, right in the middle of the night, during the second watch, he gained deep insight into karma and rebirth, basically seeing the underlying mechanics of how beings pass away and reappear based purely on their actions. Finally, culminating right before sunrise, he reached the third watch. This was the realization of the 4 noble truths and the complete, total destruction of all mental taints. His mind was completely liberated.
This is such a powerful moment. It represents the absolute victory of clarity over the blinding darkness of fear and ignorance. As the text itself states, ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who is heedful, ardent, and resolute. The literal darkness of that terrifying forest was completely, totally overcome by the blinding light of his own internal clarity and enlightenment. And finally, Section 6. Peace for future generations, the ultimate goal.
You might actually be wondering at this point, after achieving that kind of mind-blowing ultimate liberation, why on earth did the Buddha continue to meditate in a dangerous forest? Well, Jāṇussoṇi wondered the exact same thing. He asked if maybe the Buddha still had some hidden trace of greed or anger that kept him so isolated. But the Buddha quickly clarified that he stayed for 2 very specific reasons. First, simply to enjoy a pleasant, peaceful abiding in the here and now. But second, and more importantly, he did it out of deep compassion. He stayed because he wanted to serve as a living, breathing example of resilience for all future generations. He wanted to prove that a human being could face the absolute ultimate terrors of isolation and still emerge completely victorious.
As we wrap up this explainer, the Bhayabherava Sutta leaves us with a truly powerful lesson. True fearlessness isn't about frantically trying to change our external environment. It's about purifying what's on the inside. If we can face our own minds without flinching, the exact same way the Buddha faced the terrifying sounds of that dark forest, it leaves us with a profound thought to carry forward. If we commit to conquering our own internal fears today, how might that inner calm ripple out to create a lasting world peace in our crazy, chaotic, AI-driven era? Something to think about.